Oak. Orchestrated Canadian Western narrative with fresh characters and CPR era setting. Orchestrated Canadian Western narrative with fresh characters and CPR era setting. Oak. The storm came down out of the caribou like something with a grudge, and by the third night Maeve Holloway had counted her stores so many times the numbers had stopped meaning anything. 4 sticks of split spruce against the wall, a scant measure of oats gone soft and gray at the bottom of the barrel, a heel of frozen bannock she had been saving without admitting to herself that she was saving it. Oak. 2 children asleep in the one good bed, breathing the thin, careful breaths of the half-starved, and a husband 11 weeks in the ground behind the cabin where the soil had been too frozen to bury him properly, until the neighbor men came with a fire and a pick. That was the whole of her wealth in the winter of 1884, in a one-room cabin on a bench of land above Bell Creek, 3 days' hard travel from anywhere that had a name worth saying. Oak. She did not know, when she pulled on her dead husband's boots that morning, that before the sun was high she would be dragging a stranger out of the snow who would either save her family or finish it. Oak. She had married Arthur Holloway in Ontario, in a stone church with her mother weeping in the front pew. And she had come west believing what he believed, which was that a man could put his hands into clean country and pull a life out of it. He had not been wrong, exactly. He had been early. Oak. The land at the base of the mountains was good, dark, and deep when you turned it, and Arthur had broken 6 acres of it before the typhoid took him in October, quick and senseless, 4 days from a strong man chopping rails to a yellow shape under a quilt that no longer knew her name. Oak. He left her 26 years old, a son of 10 and a daughter of 7, and a debt at the Bridgewater store held by a man named Hollis Mallory, who came up the trail once a month on a good horse to remind her of it. Oak. The morning of the 4th day the wind quit. Maeve woke to a silence so total it frightened her worse than the howling had, and she lay still a moment listening to her children sleep before she made herself get up. The fire was down to a sullen orange eye. She fed it the second to last stick, knowing as she did it that she was spending tomorrow to buy today, and that there would come a morning soon when there was nothing left to feed it at all. Oak. She would have to go to the creek for kindling and chop ice for water, because the bucket inside had a skin of gray across it that her breath could no longer melt. Oak. Mum. Toby was awake, watching her from the bed with his father's grave eyes. The boy had grown solemn since October in a way that broke her more than any tears would have. Let me go for the wood. You take your rest. Oak. You'll keep your sister warm, she said, gentle but in a voice that allowed no argument. If she wakes and you're not here, she'll fret. I won't be long. Oak. Lottie stirred against her brother's shoulder, but did not wake. The girl had cried herself thin those first weeks, and then had simply stopped, gone quiet and watchful, and Maeve would have given 10 years of her life to hear the child laugh the way she used to before the fever. A bright, reckless laugh that used to fill the cabin to the rafters. Oak. She bent and kissed them both, the boy ducking from it the way 10-year-olds do, and wrapped herself in 2 shawls and Arthur's coat over them, and took up the axe and the tin pail and went out into the cold. Oak. The world was white past believing. The aspens stood bare and black against the snow, and beyond them the mountains had come close in the clear air, blue-shouldered and enormous, and the cold reached through every layer she wore and laid its hand flat against her ribs. She broke a track toward the creek, sinking to her knees at every step, her breath standing in the air like smoke from a green fire. She thought about the oats. Oak. She thought she could thin them 3 more days if she went without herself and gave the children the share. After that she did not let herself think, because there was nothing past 3 days but a long walk to Bridgewater in this weather, with 2 children, which was its own kind of dying. Oak. She was nearly to the creek bend when she saw the blood. Oak. It lay across the snow in a long smear, shocking and bright, the red of it almost obscene against all that white. Her first thought was a wolf-killed deer, and her hand tightened on the axe, and her eyes went to the tree line, but there was no carcass and no track of any animal she knew. Oak. Only a wide trough plowed through the drifts, as though something heavy had been hauled or had hauled itself, and the blood drawn out along it in a thinning line that ran toward a bank of snow heaped beneath a stand of black pine. She should have turned back. A woman alone in that country learned early that not everything that bled deserved her pity, that the bush was full of broken men running from things she did not want, following them home. She knew all of that. Oak. She went forward anyway, because she could not have lived with herself the other way, and when she came around the snowbank, she dropped the pail and it rang on the ice like a bell. Oak. A man lay face down in the snow, and he was enormous. Even fallen and still he looked too large for the country, wrapped in greasy fringed buckskin and a coat of bear hide gone black with frozen blood across the back and side. A wide felt hat lay an arm's length off where it had fallen. His hair was dark and matted with ice. For a moment she was certain he was dead, and something in her loosened with a shameful relief, because a dead man asked nothing of her. Then his hand moved. Oak. The fingers dug at the snow, slow, and a sound came out of him, low and wet and animal, and she understood that he was alive and would not be for long. Oak. It took everything she had to turn him. He came over heavy as a felled tree, and when his face rolled up to the gray sky, she saw he was perhaps 40, weathered to leather, a hard ridged scar running the line of his jaw, and beneath the dirt his skin had gone the color of tallow. His chest was the worst of it. Oak. 2 holes had been punched through the buckskin over his ribs, the blood frozen in dark rosettes around them, and she knew gunshot when she saw it, because Arthur had taken a charge of birdshot in the leg the first autumn, and she had picked it out herself by lamplight. This was no accident in the bush. Someone had stood off and shot this man twice and left him to the cold to finish. Oak. His eyes opened. They were a startling pale gray, the gray of creek ice, and wild with pain and fever and not seeing her at all. His cracked lips moved, and she had to bend close to catch it over the small wind. Oak. The field books, he rasped. Don't let Mallory. And the name went into her like the cold had, all the way to the center of her. He saw nothing. His eyes rolled white, and his head fell to the side, and he was gone again, slack and dying, and one fist stayed locked even in unconsciousness around the strap of a worn leather satchel pinned half beneath him. Oak. Maeve knelt in the snow with the dead man's coat warm on her shoulders, and did the arithmetic of it the way she did everything now, cold and clear and sick. If she left him, he would die before noon, and no one would ever know she had passed this way. If she took him in, she carried the men who had shot him straight to the door of the cabin where her children slept. She thought of Mallory's even, reasonable voice telling her the land was no place for a widow. She thought of Arthur, who used to say there was nothing out here that separated a man from a wolf but plain kindness, and who had believed it and was dead. She stood up. She did not decide so much as find that she had already decided, somewhere below the part of her that reasoned. She weighed perhaps 120 pounds. He was twice that and more. She took the bare coat by the collar, set the heels of Arthur's boots against the packed trail, leaned her whole weight backward and pulled. He moved an inch. She pulled again, and the snow that had nearly killed her 3 nights running was the only mercy in it, slick enough that 100 pounds of furious will could move 200 of dead weight a handspan at a time. She did not remember most of that 100 yards afterward. She remembered the burn in her lungs going to a taste like blood, and the black spots crowding the edges of her sight, and the way she counted, 10 pulls and rest, 10 pulls and rest, and the cabin never seeming to come closer until all at once it did. Toby, her voice tore Toby the door. The door flew back, and the boy stood in it, and his face when he saw the bloody giant in the snow went the color of the snow itself. Behind him, Lottie made a thin sound and vanished. Don't stand there, his legs. Take his legs. The boy did not waste breath on questions, which was Arthur all over again, and together the widow and her 10-year-old son hauled the dying man over the sill and onto the rag rug before the hearth, and Maeve threw her shoulder against the door and barred it against the cold and whatever else was loose in that country. The cabin filled at once with the smell of him, blood and wet fur, and the sour reek of a man days unwashed and freezing. She stripped off Arthur's coat. The fear had burned away and left something hard and useful in its place. Toby, the last stick on the fire and build it high, then the kettle and melt down what ice is in the bucket. Quick now. The boy moved. She knelt by the stranger and got her first proper look. He was even larger up close and harder, a Colt revolver, heavy at his hip and a knife the length of her forearm sheathed beside it, and that satchel still clamped in his fist as if it were grown there. She had to pry the fingers up one at a time to free it, and she set it aside without looking in it, because there was a man dying under her hands and the satchel could wait. She took up the sewing shears and cut the buckskin shirt away. The wounds were ugly, but she thought, not the end of him, not yet. One ball had gone in below the collarbone, and she could not find where it had come out. The other had taken him through the side and out the back, clean, the worst of its damage in the bleeding. She listened with her cheek near his mouth and heard no wet bubbling in the breath, no froth, and let herself believe his lungs were whole. "The whiskey from your father's trunk," she said. "Oak. And the small knife, and put it in the fire till it glows. And then, Toby, you'll take your sister behind the curtain, and you'll keep her there, and you'll both put your hands over your ears, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Oak. He understood. He was a good boy. He took Lottie's hand and drew her behind the quilt they had hung across the corner for modesty, and Maeve heard him murmuring to her, low and steady, the way she had murmured to him when he was small. Oak. For the better part of 2 hours, the cabin was a surgery. She had patched Arthur and pulled a breech calf and once set a neighbor's broken arm, but she had never gone into a man's flesh after lead, and the doing of it was worse than she had imagined, and she did it anyway. Oak. She heated the small carving knife white and let it cool to where it would not cook him, and went in after the ball below his collarbone, and when she found it lodged hard against the bone, the man came up off the floor with a roar that rattled the tin on the shelf, fevered and not knowing, and she lay across his arm with all her weight and dug until the flattened lead came free and rang in the basin. Oak. She poured the raw whiskey into both wounds, and his whole body bowed like a drawn bow, and the sound he made she would hear in her sleep for a long time after. Then she stitched him with the same wax thread she mended the children's clothes with, small, even stitches, her hands steady now that the worst was past, and she bound him in strips of an old sheet and banked him round with every blanket they owned, but the two on the children's bed. Oak. When it was finished, she sat back on her heels, shaking all over, slicked to the elbow with another person's blood, and she looked at what she had done. A wanted-looking giant of a stranger lay dying or not dying on her floor, an enemy of the one man who held the note on her land, and she had brought him under her roof with her own 2 arms. She put her face in the clean back of her wrist and breathed until the shaking stopped. Oak. Then she got up, because there were children to feed, and she thinned the oats with melted snow, and gave the children the most of it, and herself the scrapings, and she did not touch the last stick of wood. She broke up the empty oat barrel instead, and fed the staves to the fire one at a time through the night. And she sat up beside the stranger with the loaded shotgun across her knees, watching the door. Oak. She read the field books before dawn. She had to know. By candle end, she opened the satchel and found it packed with bound notebooks, the pages dense with figures and bearings, and little careful drawings of country she half recognized, creeks and benches, and the long throat of the valley below. Oak. Folded among them was a survey map, and clipped to the map a letter under a Dominion seal naming the bearer a sworn surveyor in the employ of the Railway Commission, and the bearer's name was Gideon Hayes. She did not understand most of the figures. She understood enough. There were lines drawn in red across the valley, and one of them ran square through the 6 acres Arthur had broken, and a notation beside it in a hard slanted hand. Grade favorable, water at hand, recommend acquisition. Oak. She understood that Arthur's land, the land Hollis Mallory wanted so badly and so cheaply, was the land the railway meant to come through, and that the man bleeding on her floor had been the one to write it down, and someone had shot him to keep him from carrying it back. Oak. He came around past noon the next day, the gray eyes opening clear for the first time, and finding her across the room with the shotgun, he went very still. "You've a satchel of mine," he said. His voice was a low gravel. Oak. "I read it," she said. There seemed no use in pretending otherwise. "I needed to know whether the men who shot you would be following the blood to my door." Oak. He took that in without offense, the way a man takes weather. "They'll not be back this winter," he said. "There were 3. I put one in the creek before they put me down. The other 2 left me for the cold, and the cold's better than nothing at telling a man he's dead. They'll have told Mallory I'm gone." His eyes moved to the corner where 2 small faces watched him over the edge of the quilt. He looked back at her. "Hollis Mallory hired them off me on the ridge above your creek, Oak. He wants this valley, ma'am, and your husband's bottom, most of all. The grade comes through here, or it comes through nowhere for 40 miles. Whoever holds these acres holds what the railway has to buy." Oak. "It doesn't signify," she said, and she was surprised at how steady she kept it. "I can't fight a man like that. I've no money and no man, and in 3 days I'll have no food. I had it in my mind to load the wagon and walk to Bridgewater and let him have the place for the pennies he keeps offering. There's the children to think of." Oak. The man called Gideon Hayes looked at her a long moment. Then he reached out, slow, the great scarred hand crossing the space between them, and laid it over hers where it rested on the gun. It was the first time in 11 weeks that anyone had touched her with the intent to comfort, and the warmth of it went up her arm and lodged somewhere behind her breastbone and undid her more than any words could have. "Oak. You pulled me out of the snow," he said. "I don't know yet how you did it, a slip of a thing like you. But I'll not lie in your house and eat your children's bread, and let that man take your home. I've 2 holes in me you sewed shut yourself, and I'm not worth much for a week. But I can shoot from a chair if it comes to it, and it won't come to that, because I'm going to put meat in your pot first thing I can stand, and then we'll see about Mr. Mallory." Oak. She did not answer. She turned her hand under his, so their palms met, just for a moment, and then she drew it back and went to feed the fire, and she did not let him see her face. Oak. He was as good as the word. On the 3rd day, he hauled himself up against her protests, white to the lips, and took down the rifle and made himself a crutch of the broom handle, and went out into a world gone blinding and silent under the clear sky, and was gone so long that she paced the cabin certain she had let a sick man walk out to die in the snow a second time. Oak. He came back near dark, dragging a young buck by the antlers, swaying like a felled mast, and got the words "fresh meat, missus" out of himself before he went down full length across the porch. She and Toby dragged him in for the 2nd time. Oak. But there was venison after that, hung in the cold house, and parceled out careful, and within 2 days there was color in Lottie's cheeks again, and strength in all of them, and the cabin began, against all sense, to feel like a place where people lived rather than a place where people waited. Oak. He healed like something wild, faster than any doctor would have credited, and as the strength came back to him, a thing grew up between them that neither named. He was clumsy with the children at first, and then not. Oak. He took Toby out to the woodpile, and put his own long knife into the boy's hands, and stood behind him in the cold, teaching him to cut away from his body, to read the grain, to make a thing with his hands. And Maeve watched from the window with an ache in her throat to see her son stand straighter than he had since October. Oak. Little Lottie, who had hidden from the giant for 2 whole days, crept out by inches until one evening she was sitting cross-legged at his feet, asking him whether he had ever truly seen a bear. Oak. "Seen one?" The man's mouth twitched. "Little miss, I went 3 rounds with the gentleman who's wearing my coat now. He won the wrestling. I won the coat. Call it a draw." Oak. And Lottie laughed. Oak. It came out of her bright and helpless and astonished. A sound Maeve had thought the fever had carried off for good, and it filled the cabin clean up to the rafters the way it used to, and Maeve turned hard to the stove and put her hand over her mouth and wept where none of them could see. Oak. When she had herself again, she found the man Hayes watching her across the firelight, not with pity which she could not have borne, but with something steadier, and he looked away first and let her keep her dignity, and she was grateful to him for that more than for the deer. Oak. The peace was a borrowed thing, and she knew it. On the 10th morning the sun was warm enough to start the snow dropping off the pine boughs in soft thumps, and Hayes was on the porch splitting the last of the deadfall into stove lengths, his wounds scabbed to red seams, and Maeve was inside with her hands in the wash-water, humming a tune from a church she would never see again. The axe stalks stopped. She looked up. Oak. He was standing dead still with the axe head resting on the block, his head turned, listening, and every line of him had gone to iron. Oak. She came to the door drying her hands. "Mr. Hayes, what is it?" Oak. He did not turn. He reached down and slipped the thong off the hammer of his Colt. "Get the children, Maeve." He had not used her Christian name before. He used it now, low and flat. "Put them in the root cellar and pull the boards over. Go on now. Don't run, just go." Oak. She heard it then under the dripping of the snow. Far down the valley trail, faint and rhythmic and unmistakable. The crunch of shod hooves in crusted snow, more than one horse, coming up. Oak. She did not run. She gathered her children with hands that did not shake because she would not let them. And she put Toby and Lottie down into the cold dark of the root cellar among the last of the turnips. And she knelt to their 2 pale faces in the lamplight. Oak. "You'll be brave," she said. "You'll not make a sound whatever you hear. Toby, you'll keep her close." She kissed them both. "Your father is watching us. Whatever happens, you'll know I love you to the end of the world and back." She pulled the boards across and weighted them and stood up and took down the shotgun and went out to stand beside the man on the porch, because she had decided long ago in the snow that she was not the running kind. Oak. There were 4 of them. Hollis Mallory rode at the front of them on his good gray horse, fur-collared, soft-handed, his breath standing pleasant in the cold, and the three behind him were not soft at all. They drew up in the dooryard at an easy distance, and Mallory smiled at her as he always smiled, like a man come to talk reasonable terms. "Oak, Mrs. Holloway." Then his eye found the big man on the porch, and the smile thinned at the edges, just slightly, a crack in good plaster. "Well, I was told you were dead, Mr. Hayes." "Oak." "You were told wrong," Hayes said. "It's a thing that happens to men who hire their thinking done cheap." "Oak, you shot a man dead in my employ." "Oak." "I shot a man who was shooting me. The constable at Bridgewater will care about the difference even if you don't." Hayes had not raised his voice and had not raised the Colt and stood entirely easy, and the ease of him was the most dangerous thing in the yard. "You'll want to think hard now, Mallory, about how this morning ends. You've 4 guns and I've 2, and one of those 2 is a woman who'll not miss a man at 12 feet with a load of buck. You might carry the porch, you might, Oak, but you'll do it as a man with witnesses in a country that hangs you for it, and not as a man buying a debt off a poor widow. The railway knows my name, they know my books are out. The Dominion knows where I was sent, and what I went to find. You can murder me twice over, and you cannot unsurvey the valley. It's done. Oak. The grade comes through these acres no matter who's standing on them, and the only question left is whether it comes through honest, with a widow rich for selling her right to it, or whether it comes through over the bodies of a woman and her babies, with you swinging from a tree in Bridgewater before the thaw. Choose. Oak. Maeve watched the men behind Mallory and saw it land on them, saw 2 of them shift their reins and look at one another. Hired men acting up suddenly lay, what they were being asked to die for, and finding the sum poor. The third sat his horse and watched Hayes the way one fighting dog watches another, and it was that one who made the move, his hand dropping for the gun on his hip, fast and sure. Oak. Hayes was faster, even wounded, even standing easy. The colt came up and spoke once, and the man went out of his saddle into the snow and the horse bolted, and in the same breath Maeve had the shotgun to her shoulder, and both hammers back, and her eye on Mallory's chest, and the silence after the single shot was so complete she could hear the spent powder hiss in the snow. Oak. Anyone else, she said, and her voice did not shake, had better be very sure. Oak. No one else was sure. The 2 remaining hired men put their hands wide and walked their horses backward, and then they turned and rode, and they did not look back, and that left only Hollis Mallory, on his fine gray in the trampled red snow of her dooryard, his soft hands empty and beginning at last to tremble. Oak. You'll come down off that horse, Hayes said, slow. Oak. They kept him in the barn 3 days under guard, Hayes sleeping across the door with the colt, while Hayes's wound mended, and a boy from a neighboring claim rode hard for Bridgewater, with a letter the surveyor wrote out in his hard slanting hand. There was an evening in those 3 days that Maeve never spoke of to anyone after. Oak. She went out to the barn alone in the dark with the shotgun, and she looked at the man tied to the post, the man whose patient, reasonable threats had stolen the floor from under her in the worst weeks of her life, the man whose hired guns had nearly orphaned her children that very morning, and she put the muzzle of the gun against his fine fur collar, and she felt the whole long winter rise up in her, the grave behind the cabin, and the empty oat barrel, and the thin gray oats she had gone without. Oak, and her finger lay along the trigger and trembled there. Oak. It'd be easy, she said, and her voice was strange to her own ears. There's no one to see, the wolves have you by morning. Arthur in the ground, my children near starved, all on your account. It would be the easiest thing in the world. Oak. Then do it, Mallory whispered, and he was weeping, all the smooth reason gone out of him. Or for God's sake, stop holding the gun on me. Oak. She stood there a long time. Behind her, in the doorway, she heard Hayes come and stop, and say nothing at all. Not stop her, not urge her, only stand and let it be hers. And she was grateful to him for that the rest of her days. She thought of what Arthur used to say about the wolf and the man. She thought of Lottie's laugh going up into the rafters. She lowered the gun. Oak. Don't, she said, and she was not sure whether she said it to Mallory or to herself. I'll not ruin what's left of me on the likes of you. The rope will do the work, and the rope's the law's, not mine. Get him out of my sight. And she turned her back on the man who had taken her family to the edge of ruin and walked out into the clean, cold night. And the hardest and the best thing she ever did was to walk away from that barn with the gun unfired. Oak. The mounted police came up from Bridgewater on the 3rd day, a sergeant named Innes and 2 constables, breath frosting on their scarlet, and they took Hollis Mallory away in irons to answer for murder and fraud, and the hiring of men to kill a sworn officer of the survey. A magistrate's man came after, and then, when the news had run down the wire, a man from the Railway Commission himself, who sat at Maeve's small table and drank her thin tea and explained to her, slow and plain so she would understand it, that Arthur's broken acres were the keystone of the whole western grade. She did not have to sell the land. She had only to grant the right-of-way across it, and the price they named for that right-of-way was a number she made him say twice, because she did not believe a woman could be paid such a sum for letting a railway lay iron across a field her husband had cleared with his own hands and his own death. Spring came late and all at once. The snow went off the bench above Bell Creek and left the dark earth Arthur had loved, steaming faintly in the morning sun, and there was a new roof on the cabin and real glass set into the one window where there had been oiled paper, and the cold house was full, and Toby had a knife of his own, and Lottie a half-grown collie pup that the sergeant had brought up from Bridgewater because, he said gruffly, a place this far out wanted a dog. Maeve stood on the mended porch one morning, watching the children chase the pup through the wet grass, and the laughter of them carried up to her clear and ordinary, and she let herself believe at last that they had come through. Gideon Hayes was loading his horse. He had been healed a fortnight, and they had both known the day was coming, and neither had named it the way they had not named the rest of it. He cinched his saddle and gave the horse a flat-handed pat, and came up the porch steps and took off his hat, and stood turning it in his big scarred hands like a boy. The passes are open, he said, and his voice was not as steady as he meant it to be. Commission's got the northern lines wanting running yet. I'm a surveyor, missus. I'm paid to be where the maps aren't. He looked at the mountains rather than at her. I'm no kind of man to keep. I don't sleep soft. I don't sit still. I've spent more nights under a tree than a roof. I'd only bring you grief in the end. You brought me my life, Maeve said. She came across the porch and stood close and put her hand flat against the bare hide coat, over the seam where her own stitches had healed under his shirt. You put meat in my children's mouths. You taught my boy to make a thing with his hands. You gave my girl back her laugh, and I had buried it, Mr. Hayes. I had buried it with their father and given it up for gone. Don't tell me what you'd bring me. I've kept the accounts in this house through a winter that should have killed us all, and I know better than any soul alive what you're worth. He looked at her then. You're a wealthy woman now. You could go back east. A fine house. A pianoforte even. You played, you said once. I don't want the east, she said, fierce and low. I've a home here that I half killed myself to keep, and I'll not leave it for any fine house in Ontario. But it's an awful quiet home, Gideon, with only the three of us in it. The northern lines will keep. The maps will keep. The wild country isn't going anywhere. It's been waiting on you 1,000 years, and it can wait a season more. The giant of the Caribou, who had faced down 4 armed men on a porch and walked out of a snowbank that should have been his grave, stood entirely defenseless before the plain, honest look of the widow Holloway. He let the hat drop from his fingers onto the boards. His great rough hands came up and framed her face, and his thumbs wiped the wet from beneath her eyes with a gentleness that did not belong to hands that size, and a slow, astonished smile broke across all that hard-weathered country of his face like a thaw. I reckon, he said, the northern lines can wait at that. Somebody's got to teach that boy to shoot straight before he takes his own eye out. And Maeve Holloway leaned into the warm, rough wool of his coat as the spring wind came up out of the valley, carrying the smell of turned earth and snowmelt and growing things. And somewhere below them the pup was barking and the children were laughing, and the long, terrible winter let go of the bench above Bell Creek at last and did not come back. I keep coming back to the moment Maeve Holloway stood over that bleeding stranger in the snow and did the cold arithmetic of it. Her last stick of wood, her thin gray oats, 2 children asleep who had no one else in the world, and chose to pull him in anyway. People like to call a thing like that softness, but I've come to believe it's the opposite. It takes a hard, steady kind of decency to be good when being good might cost you everything, and that single choice is the seed the whole rest of her life grew from. She didn't know Gideon Hayes carried the survey that would change her fortune. She couldn't have. She only knew a man was dying and that turning away would have made her into something she refused to be. What strikes me most is that her kindness alone wasn't what saved her. Plenty of good people get ruined by the world, What turned the corner was that Maeve was also sharp. She read those field books by candle-end when she could barely keep her eyes open, and she understood what she was looking at. That her dead husband's broken acres were the keystone the railway needed. A gentler, simpler woman might have signed the land away to Mallory for pennies and walked off grateful to be rid of it. Maeve saw the shape of the trap and the shape of the way out, and that clear-eyed reading of her own situation was every bit as important as the rope she used to drag a man twice her weight through the drifts. And then there's the barn. I think about it more than the gunfight, more than the rescue. She had the shotgun against Hollis Mallory's collar, and every reason in the world hanging on her finger, and she put the gun down, not because she was weak, because she understood that hatred would have hollowed her out and left nothing worth saving for Toby and Lottie. Walking out of that barn with the gun unfired took more strength than pulling the trigger ever could have. So when I watch what became of that family, the new roof, the children laughing, Lottie's laugh coming back up into the rafters where the fever had stolen it, I don't read it as luck arriving out of a snowbank. I read it as the plain working out of who Maeve already was. The compassion to act, the wits to understand what she'd acted into, and the endurance to hold the line through a winter that should have killed her. Those three things together built the ending, and any one of them missing and the story turns dark. That's the part I'd want anyone to carry away. Circumstances will always be partly out of our hands, but the person we've quietly built ourselves into, long before the test comes, that's the part that decides how the test ends.